Should you read Chinese with or without Pinyin? What are the pros and cons of reading on your phone? And how do you learn to read Chinese people's handwriting? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, I'm going to answer 3 questions about reading in Chinese. And as usual, these Q&As coincide with challenges on Hacking Chinese, and this month the topic is reading. So if you feel you ought to read more and need a motivational boost, this is a good opportunity. Head over to challenges.hackingchinese.com and join the challenge. It's completely free, and the challenge starts on the 10th and lasts until the end of the month. If you listen to this episode in the future, you can of course still head over to challenges.hackingchinese.com to see what challenge is on when you are listening. This month's challenge is sponsored by MyLingua, which is an online reading resource which helps you pick suitable reading materials based on what you already know, and also provide a lot of tools to make harder reading content easier to access. So check that out in the article on Hacking Chinese. You get free access to the service throughout the challenge. And a few active participants will also gain free access beyond the challenge itself. Okay, so let's get started with the Q&A part of this episode. And the first question is about reading with or without Pinyin. The second question is about pros and cons with reading Chinese on your phone, as opposed to, say, in a book or on your computer. And the final question is about how to learn to read other people's handwriting. So I'll go through the questions one by one, and as usual I have adapted the question slightly to fit a wider audience, so my idea here is of course not only to answer the question as it was asked, but also to do so in a way that is interesting to people beyond the person who asked the question. If you have any questions about learning to read in Chinese, or indeed any other aspect of learning the language, feel free to send an email to editor@hackingchinese.com, and I might feature your question in an upcoming Q&A. So let's dive into question 1 about reading with or without Pinyin, and this one comes from Carl, and he basically wants to know if he should use Pinyin or not. And if you read online or listen to different learners or teachers talk about this, you might get the impression that Pinyin is either essential or it's a crutch that will actually stop you from learning to read Chinese. So which one is it? Well, as usual, it depends, and this is probably also why you get different answers depending on whom you ask and what your situation is like. Pinyin can obviously be very helpful. For example, if you have Pinyin for difficult characters when reading a printed book, it makes it much easier to look up characters you don't know or pronounce them if you've forgotten how they are pronounced. If you know them in the spoken language, this also bridges the gap between the two, because you can see the Pinyin and thereby understand what it means, and now you have a functional bridge between spoken and written Chinese without having to go through a dictionary. If your goal is to practice pronunciation or reading aloud or anything like that, it can also be helpful to use Pinyin, because you're actually after the spoken language rather than the written language here. And I think this is the key. If you want to practice spoken Chinese based on a written script or a written record of some kind, using Pinyin is not a bad idea, because your goal is ultimately to practice spoken Chinese. But if your goal is to read Chinese, to improve your reading ability as such, then you should not use Pinyin, because the likelihood is that if you have Pinyin over all the characters, you are not even going to look at the characters, or you will do so only occasionally. And this is of course a problem, because Chinese people, when they write in their own language, use characters. They don't use Pinyin. Well, they might use Pinyin in their input method, but the thing that comes out at the end is still Chinese characters, and that is what you need to learn to read. While the principle of practicing what you want to get better at doesn't always apply directly when learning a language, if in doubt, just practice the thing you want to get better at. And in this case, if you want to learn to read Chinese characters, you should read Chinese characters. You should not have Pinyin. Naturally, if you read digitally, you can still access the meaning and pronunciation of characters you've forgotten or unknown characters simply by clicking on them if you have a pop-up dictionary, or simply copy-pasting them somewhere else. And this then grants you the benefits of having Pinyin without having it on by default. Of course, if you use the pop-up dictionary all the time and simply slide your cursor along the text and just look at the Pinyin, this is the same thing as having Pinyin on by default or having it printed over the characters. But I think you get my point. So to summarize, from a student perspective, I think this is relatively simple. If you want to improve reading ability, you read without Pinyin, and if you want to do anything else, especially something related to the spoken language, well then using Pinyin can be a good idea. This is slightly more complex if you're a teacher or textbook author, because then you can do lots of fancy things, mixing them together, for example, including Pinyin only for certain characters that you have strategically chosen, and so on. But this is not really something you do as a student, except via the pop-up dictionaries I mentioned. But I think this is enough of an answer to this question for now. Before moving on to the next question, I'd also like to say that there are ways of including pronunciation information without using Pinyin, especially if we're talking about tones. For example, you can color the characters if you have a favorite color scheme, or you can add tone marks on top of the characters without using Pinyin. In this case, you can read characters but still keep a focus on tones. So that's an option if you want to do that, especially useful if you want to read aloud. This brings us to the second question, which is from Jessica, and she wants to know if it's a good idea to read Chinese on your phone compared to, say, your computer or a printed book. I think this question is best answered by considering it as two separate questions. So one is whether or not digital reading is a good idea, and the second question is which pros and cons apply specifically to reading on your phone compared to, say, a tablet or maybe your computer. When it comes to digital reading, this has huge benefits overall. That doesn't mean you should always read digitally and that there are no downsides, but on the whole, digital reading is great. It allows you to look up characters whenever you want, and you don't have to flip through dictionaries for minutes to find what a new character means. You can also look things up easily, save interesting passages, create flashcards, or whatever you want. But basically, having a digital copy of the thing you're reading and studying that is much easier than doing something on a printed page. Now, this doesn't mean that digital reading is perfect and that you should only read digitally. There are some downsides because you might not always be able to read text digitally, and if you don't learn to deal with texts without your pop-up dictionary and online resources, you probably won't develop the strategies that you need to do this. So reading without these tools is also an essential part of learning how to read. And just to bring up one example, if you encounter a character you don't know, if your first instinct is always to look it up by clicking on it, what are you supposed to do then when you encounter it in a book where you can't click on it, or on a sign when you are traveling in China? You can't click on that, and if you don't happen to have your phone available or you have no internet or whatever, you still need to be able to read characters. And this involves figuring out what things mean based on context, and this is a strategy you develop by using it. So simply reading digitally all the time might not be the solution, but it does offer substantial benefits. So reading digitally in itself is a good idea. And this is something I have covered on Hacking Chinese before, and as usual, I'll put links in the show notes. So let's move on to the second part of the question, which is reading on your phone specifically. And I think this has several advantages, and some of them might not be too obvious. I have read many novels in Chinese on my phone, and while I wouldn't consider reading a novel in English on my phone, I think there are several advantages with doing so in Chinese specifically. Naturally, we do have all the benefits of digital reading in general, but I do think that reading on your phone has some extra advantages. For example, most learners feel intimidated when they open a novel in Chinese. The text is rather small and each page is rather big, so that means you're faced with a wall of Chinese text, and simply reading a page might feel like an insurmountable obstacle. But if it's on your phone, you can adjust the text size, you can make the characters big and friendly, and one screen might only contain 50 or maybe 100 characters, and this feels much manageable than a full-sized page. Another advantage is that most people have their phones with them all the time, and this means you can read whenever you want. Maybe it will be tricky to make use of very small pockets of time, because you might have forgotten exactly where you left off last time, but if you do this frequently enough, you can still read a fair amount throughout the day that would otherwise not be available for reading. Moving on to the final benefit, I think that most people who use flashcards also do so on their phone and not their computer, and that means that the step or the distance from the texts that you read to your flashcard app is considerably smaller. This means that if you encounter grammar patterns or words that you really think you ought to learn or remember later, you can easily add them as flashcards. And this could also be a downside if you add too many, but the convenience is still there, and as long as you don't add everything you encounter and focus on things you really ought to learn, this is a definite advantage. This brings us to the third and final question, which is about reading handwriting in Chinese. So, when I talk about handwriting on this podcast and on hacking Chinese in general, I normally talk about your handwriting. And my basic message is that, well, it's a good idea to learn to write some characters by hand, like a core set of vocabulary, so you learn how the writing system works and what it feels like to write characters. But in general, in modern digital societies, you don't actually need to write by hand that often. Maybe you might need to fill out a form occasionally, but when you do, you will probably have access to your phone and can look things up if you want to. However, even if you can decide to not invest that much time into your own handwriting, you can't decide that other people shouldn't write things in Chinese to you by hand. I mean, this is something that happens quite often actually if you live in a Chinese-speaking environment. People write notes, they might write letters, there might be information boards, or whatever it might be. There is handwriting Chinese all over the place because native speakers do write by hand, even if they of course also use their phones and type a lot. The problem is that from a second language perspective, learning to read Chinese people's handwriting is not easy. Some people write very fast, they use some kind of semi-cursive form where they join strokes together, or they simply write very sloppily sometimes, just like people do in any language. And if you're not used to this, it's going to be very hard. If you have basically read most things in your textbook or maybe things your teacher write on the board and then encounter real handwriting by an average person, you will probably feel dismayed. It feels like it's a different language. The worst case is of course calligraphy. So you've studied Chinese for a few years and your friend sees a painting and they ask you, hey, what does the calligraphy in the corner here mean? And you have simply no clue, because no amount of reading typed or printed text will prepare you for reading calligraphy. Now, I don't want to focus on calligraphy here because that's not what this question is about. It's about how to read normal people's handwriting. This is something I have covered in an article on hacking Chinese, which hasn't made its way to the podcast yet, but there are a few principles or steps I think you can take, so let's have a look at them. So the first is to understand stroke order and how characters are written in general. So if you know how to write a character by hand, it's much more likely that you will then also understand when somebody else writes it by hand. And this is because you understand stroke order, and when you write strokes in the same order as native speakers do, you will see that the way that they join strokes together makes sense. And this is not hard to see. If you take a character like ko, it is normally written in 3 strokes. We have a vertical stroke, we have a rightward stroke that then goes down, and then we have the bottom horizontal stroke closing off the ko. Now, if you haven't studied Chinese stroke order, you might write this as 1 stroke, so maybe going right, down, left, up, and then you have your square, which is a little bit awkward, but will still result in a legible character. The problem is that when most Chinese people write this character very quickly, they do not write it in 1 stroke like that. They still join the strokes, but not in a way that is anyway intuitive if you think of this as a 1-stroke component. Instead, what many native speakers do is write something that looks a little bit like the number 12 with the numerals joined together. And this is done in 1 stroke. It's a little bit hard to describe this on the podcast, but this is what happens if you use the correct stroke order but don't lift your pen and write it very fast. And if you're just used to seeing this character printed in a textbook, for example, there is no way you will be able to make sense of this, or at least it's much harder than if you've written the character correctly yourself. So in essence, what I'm saying is that when you know where 1 stroke is supposed to end and where the next is supposed to begin, you can start making sense of people who join these strokes together, and this will be more intuitive the better your own handwriting is. This on its own, however, will not enable you to read Chinese people's handwriting. That is largely down to exposure and experience. This is not rocket science. The more you try to read other people's handwriting, the better you will get at it. And the reason most second language learners are very bad at it is that they only ever read what's in their textbook or in some online digital resource, or maybe what their teacher writes on the whiteboard. And this type of writing then is way too neat and orderly to prepare you for normal people's handwriting. So this means that the first step you should take if you want to get better at reading handwriting is simply to read more handwriting. Like I said earlier, if you're surrounded by people who write and read Chinese, they will use handwriting all over the place. So start by reading things people write. But if you don't, you can also do this digitally. There is a fair amount of handwriting online as well. And you can also use particular handwriting fonts. These fonts will display characters in a handwritten style. And of course, it's not the same as actual handwriting. For example, humans don't write the same character exactly the same way every time, which these fonts still do, but the style is still much closer to what a normal human would write compared to the font used in your textbook. I like using fonts because it's rather easy to convert something that you would have read anyway into something that looks like handwriting. So let's say that your teacher has written you an email that you need to read. Well, you can then display it using a handwritten font and read it that way instead. There are also many of these fonts, and most of them are free, so you can also switch between different fonts to make sure you don't stay with the same type of font all the time. This is similar to learning to understand regionally accented Mandarin, in the sense that the first time you encounter that deviates from what you have seen from the standard, you will be completely thrown off, and the second time it will still be hard. But the 100th or 500th time you encounter someone who speaks with an accent, it will not be as difficult, so the more variants you see, the easier it becomes to deal with the next one. This is essentially the case for handwriting too, so if you've only seen things in your textbook and you see somebody write by hand, it will look like a different language, as I said. You might not be able to read anything. But when you've done this 100 times with different fonts, different real people, or just practiced enough, this will not be that hard. Maybe it will take some time getting used to the specific way somebody writes, but it's still much easier than the first time you did this. As a teacher, this happens to me in Chinese and other languages too. So if you read, say, an essay written by a student, you might find it pretty hard to read it at the beginning, but as you read further into the text, you learn how they write things and it becomes easier to deal with. Before wrapping up, I'd just like to add that some people's handwriting can be incredibly hard to read for Chinese people as well. The clearest example of this might be doctors' handwriting, which is incredibly hard to read and is almost like a secret language in itself. And then there are also many people who use various forms of semi-cursive or cursive handwriting, which, if you haven't studied it, will be very hard. So then it's not just a matter of figuring out how they joined the strokes in the standard way of writing, but more like learning a separate new way of writing some of these characters. Learning how to do that goes beyond the scope of this Q&A, I think, but the principle is the same. If you study this yourself and you learn how these forms are written, they will also be easier to read. And again, it's all about exposure and experience. That brings us to the end of this episode. I hope you found it interesting, and don't forget to send your questions my way so I can include them in upcoming episodes. And in the meantime, I'll see you in the reading challenge. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.